Hello and welcome to this Business Green in the studio with interview. I'm James Murray, editor of Business Green, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Alan Smith-Gillespie, Associate Director at the Carbon Trust. So, Elaine, thanks for joining us.
Hi James, great to be here.
Today we're keen to talk about business model innovation and some of these really exciting new trends that are informing so many businesses in the UK currently. The first question, I suppose, is both from an environmental and economic perspective. Why do businesses need to reassess and potentially change their underlying business models?
So currently business models are predicated on a broadly linear model. So extracting resources, manufacturing them through a number of steps, selling them, being used or consumed, and then oftentimes wasted and the value lost effectively. And that model is actually well adapted to the system as it is mainly today. So one of relatively abundant resources and also very low or no pricing of externalities through regulation, for example. So to date, it's worked reasonably well. But as we saw in the recent commodity boom a few years ago, it created a wake-up call for a number of companies to understand what is happening in terms of our input costs. Commodity costs doubled effectively within the space of 5 years. And that created a lot of questions around, can we do things more efficiently? Is this sustainable? And can we do things with our system that can actually create a much more efficient order of magnitude terms system?
And obviously some of those commodity costs have eased off a little bit in more recent years and dropped in a lot of cases. I mean, has that maybe encourage some companies to go back to bad habits, or do they still need to continue to look at how these business models operate?
So that's a really interesting question because indeed about 4 years ago or so commodity costs came down, and so a lot of companies perhaps are thinking, well, maybe this was a temporary a blip in a sense, and that business models can continue as they are. But if you actually look at the macro trends, what this tells us is that commodity costs not only will increase, but also the pressures on the environment and on the system will also be getting worse. So what we're seeing is in the space of the next 10 or so years to 2030, global population will be increasing by at least another 1 billion people. But actually what is even more important is the fact that the middle class will be doubling. So we'll be adding an extra 2.5 billion middle-class citizens, and that will also generate the consumption patterns that ensue. And so what we see is as countries develop, consumption of resources, natural resources increases. And that'll actually create, again, the conditions in which commodity prices and pressures on the environment will be getting worse. So companies and organizations need to look forward to that and start putting in place now the thinking and the transitions in the business models that will avoid some of the worst impacts of that happening and enable them to adapt to that when it does.
And obviously if they don't, there's a lot of people who say that simply business as usual, continuing with these models completely unadjusted, is going to become unviable at some point.
Yes, absolutely. So business as usual is to continue with this broadly linear approach to value chains. What companies need to start thinking about now is how do they actually put in place approaches that capture and preserve the value of products in value chains for as long as possible and avoid that being lost. And in particular, to cycle the materials through value chains so that you actually don't get the losses that we see currently. When we go back to what we saw during the last commodity boom, not only were prices increasing, but we were also seeing a lot of resource protectionism, so countries putting in place measures to actually control the export of resources. So we saw that, for example, where it's in China. And so companies will face that again if they continue with current business as usual. And that also requires working with government in order to innovate the system as a whole, because there's only so much that companies can do on their own. But there is actually a fair number of things that they do have some control over, and that is particularly how they actually structure their business models.
What type of businesses will this transition impact? Is this literally everyone that has to start to think along these lines?
So businesses that are resource intensive, of course, are going to be at the forefront of this. Any company that manufactures things, packaged goods as well, consumer goods, and also in the agricultural food and drink space as well. So all of these sectors are going to have to really think about how much more efficient can they actually make their value chains, and can their business models really drive order of magnitude improvements in resource efficiency. And it's also important to think about this not just as an avoidance of risk, which is of course very important, but also one of opportunity. So there's actually a great opportunity for companies to create more value out of the products and services that they sell, and also for a range of other companies and service companies to help them and enable them to do that. So we've seen, for example, when we did analysis on the ICT sector, that mobile and ICT technology can play a great role in actually driving efficiency, helping companies develop, for example, platforms through which they can share resources, track goods around the system, make sure that they're recovered and returned. So there's a great opportunity not just for manufacturers and makers of things, but also for service providers to help enable that transition to a more resource efficient system.
Obviously easy to sort of go in and say to businesses, you need to change your business model. What at a practical level does that mean? What do businesses need to be thinking about currently? What do they need to be considering in terms of investment? What's the sort of practical checklist that companies need to go through to ensure that they are ready for these potential risks and able to harness these opportunities?
So it's important for companies to think about the context that they're in, and to look a few years out. So we're already seeing today, for example, in the EU, regulations around waste, around extended producer responsibility to ensure that products at the end of life are returned or dealt with in appropriate ways to promote recycling or losses to the system. So the writing is starting to get on the wall in terms of regulations. But as I said earlier on, companies can also look forward to see where the megatrends are happening in terms of consumer demand, and how this will probably impact, again, resource costs and availability of resources. So companies need to spend some time to think about that sort of longer picture.
Yeah.
And that in a sense starts setting the lay of the land of what they need to be thinking about and where the challenges and opportunities may be coming from. The next thing is to start thinking about their value proposition. So the actual bundle of products and services that they offer to the market and offer to certain offer to consumer segments, and seeing how is it that their business model will be affected by the trends in a positive or negative way, and how it is that they can add even more value to their customers and capture that value in the context of the changing environment.
Can you give any examples of companies that you think are doing this particularly well, or that have either made the transition successfully or are making good progress towards changing their business models?
Yeah, there are a lot of really great examples. And the really interesting thing, of course, from our perspective is that these aren't necessarily labeled as being sustainability innovations, but they effectively are. So one prime example is Caterpillar. Many years ago, setting up a remanufacturing sub-brand, effectively Cat Reman, and a whole new business where they've implemented a remanufacturing model where they actually get their machines before they get damaged at end of life, or parts of the machines, bring them back into the manufacturing system and actually remanufacture it. So they don't lose the material value of the products at the end of their life, but they bring it back up to spec, put on a new warranty, and sell it back. And it's really a win-win. So the customers benefit because they're able to buy a product which meets their needs, which is typically at a lower cost than an entirely new one or the top of the range latest model. And also a win for Caterpillar because it's able to produce things at a much lower cost. So what we see there is two things. From the financial perspective, up to 40%, 60% even sometimes cost reductions in the manufacturing process compared to new. And in terms of carbon and energy emissions, up to 80% reduction in carbon. So it's a great win from a sustainability and cost perspective, but also from the customer perspective. And there's other examples as well. There's Hilti Power Tools, a Swiss company that's moved from a product-centric model where it was mainly about selling power tools to the building trade to a service-centric model where they actually provide almost the tools as a service, and they manage the provision and the availability of tools when and where they're needed. And it actually enables them to compete with lower cost competitors from other countries. And there are other examples as well in different sectors. In buildings, for example, BAM Construction is looking at circular economy across the value chain, from the circular use of resources to implementing services within their buildings that are done in a circular way, and also looking at the whole life cycle, so downstream when buildings are demolished, how to actually reuse those resources. And even things such as, for example, modular design of buildings. So it really cuts across all kinds of industries.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one, modular design of buildings, isn't it? We're seeing that start to come, and this idea that they're just old-fashioned prefabs is completely outdated. We're seeing a sort of very modern approach to really resource-efficient construction. What would your top tips be for organisations who recognise that they need to change but maybe really don't know where to start? Because this is quite big transformations you're talking about within many organisations that requires investment, management buy-in and all the other things that you need to drive forward that kind of change. I mean, what would, from the companies you have worked with, what's the sort of few things that they need to look to do?
So I think one of the first things is actually to understand what we mean when we say business model, because some starting points is to look at the product, for example, and looking at things like eco-design. Other things include looking at process changes. Now, those are important and have their place, but I would say the companies benefit from taking a step back and actually looking at the very definition of business model, which is how do companies create, deliver, and capture that value. And that effectively, the starting point is the value proposition, looking at how that delivers value to customers, and how then that value is captured through the revenue model, whether, for example, it's looking at customer relationships, looking at the channels through which companies reach their customers, and all the back end, effectively the operating model of the business, which includes key activities, key relationships, key partners, key resources, and of course the cost structure behind that. So that might sound like a lot, but actually understanding that and having that common language is really important. So when companies start thinking about business models, they need to make sure that people actually understand what they're talking about and are on the same page. Now, in terms of them thinking about how to innovate that business model, the first step is to understand what your current business model is, and that can be done through, for example, workshops and using a common framework for assessing what the business model is, and then creating options and iterating that. So creating new designs, for example, and then rapidly testing that with the market. So understanding what the business model actually is today around a common language, and then putting in place approaches to experiment are really important and useful. A lot of companies that are leading this often have quite a visionary leader. A lot of it is coming down from the CEO, but actually a lot can also come from people across the organization. The important thing is to make sure that there is a culture of innovation within that company, willingness to take risks, and also space for people to think and experiment.
And to really test it, to focus group it and do the research, I suppose, is absolutely crucial. How do you expect these business models to evolve over the next decade? I mean, asking you to look into a crystal ball, and we're in a period of such volatility, that's a very difficult thing to do. But are there any areas that you think, we are definitely going to see change here, and how will that impact investors and businesses over that longer term 10-year time frame?
Yeah, so business models will be changing in quite radical ways. I think we'll have to change in radical ways based on what we talked about earlier on. What we'll be seeing is companies experimenting with new models to deliver value to customers. So, for example, a lot of companies are looking at, rather than selling products, to actually offering them as a service. Now, what that means is that either new companies will be created to manage those assets, or those assets will be still owned by the company that provides them. An example, for example, BMW, where they're going from a manufacturer of cars to a provider of mobility solutions. So cars are still needed, but who's going to own and manage those cars? It's no longer going to be owned by customers. So that has very important implications for the financial services industry, including the financing of those kinds of models, insurance, for example, and also enablers around technology, for example. There'll be quite a shift in the ecosystem, not just of current companies, but all the companies and systems required to actually enable that change. So there'll be a lot of opportunities for investors. I think also investors need to see who is doing and putting in place a model that will work in 10 years' time. So if we see today a number of pressures around resource costs, that'll be coming down the line. Investors will want to understand, well, who is actually creating business models that are going to be viable in that new type of environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Just finally, we ask everyone who comes in for these interviews how you came to work in this sector and what engaged you first with the green economy and environmental issues. Is it a long-standing interest, or did you just fall into it, or what was the motivation?
It actually is a long-standing interest. Back when I was at high school even, I was very interested in environmental issues. A lot of people were. I did my internship just before starting university at the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. So actually back then I had my eye on that and very interested in it. I then subsequently worked for many years in a career in business, working on issues around strategy, operational improvement, and so forth, both here and in Asia. And eventually, in a sense, I came back full circle, back into this area, but very much from a business lens. And so actually, these areas of business model innovation and helping companies develop a strategy that is sustainable both financially and also environmentally is something that I found actually fascinating. It really brings together a number of different issues. And so that brought me to the Carbon Trust.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Elaine Smith-Gillespie, Associate Director at the Carbon Trust. And thank you all for joining us for our latest In the Studio with broadcast. We'll hope to see you all again soon.